Hey everyone, this is your Professor O'Million Chuck, and today I'm going to finish up the second part of our unit on the problems facing immunizations. And today I want to talk about the problems of liberty, fairness, and trust. All right, so this is going to be the ones that we're really interested in. Now, before we get into the specifics of that stuff, I want you to take a look at this video here. I'll have a little link come up here in the upper corner of the video. You should be able to click on that and it'll take you to it. So just watch the first 4.5 minutes of that, okay? Give you a chance to do that. All right, now that you've done that, I want you to just kind of take a look at Jenny Margulis's response. All right, so this is the woman that they interviewed kind of at the beginning of that video. She lives in Oregon, and she is, the mom who has the PhD in English, right? And it's such a great example of a vaccine hesitant mom, right? So highly educated woman, white woman, actually. That's part of the demographics that people who do this sort of thing. And she's very informed. She's written lots of stuff. Okay, she's got all kinds of stuff on her website. She's got all these different books that she's written about, addiction. Here's the vaccine-friendly plan that she's written. Stuff about babies, right? And then a book about slavery, it looks like. So anyway, kind of wide-ranging interests here, and you can kind of check her out, right? Maybe respond to her in some way if you, if you're interested. Okay, so here's the thing, though, that I want you to kind of consider for today's lecture, and maybe just going forward in this class, and also maybe just in life. Some of you, I don't know if you're going into public health or not, but here it is. Do you agree that you can be pro-vaccine but against the current vaccine schedule? And then tell me why or why not, right? Or maybe put another way to help you kind of think about this, right? Are you anti-science if you're against the current schedule, right? And that's another way of thinking about this, right? Because she certainly would not think so. She actually considers herself to be pro-vaccine, against the current schedule, and very, very much pro-science, right? And so she thinks that she's fighting science with science here, and that's what we need to think about. All right. The other reason I had you kind of watch that and look at her website is because it does tie into the book that was being reviewed in that piece by Hick, right? And this is the book by Mark Largent, Vaccine: The Debate in Modern America. I'm currently reading through it right now. It's pretty interesting. He gets into all the different debates that have arisen in the last 25 years, that have to do with thimerosal, autism, and celebrities like Jenny McCarthy, and all that kind of stuff. And what's kind of interesting about it here is that he has to, this is basically from the review, and I think this is pretty much a good, accurate summary of the book. Right, Largent's thesis is that vaccine hesitancy is rooted in concerns about condescending medical authorities, corporate power, and personal responsibility to protect and care for children. And boy, is that ever true of Jenny Margulis there. She certainly cannot tolerate the condescension that comes from medical authorities. If you read Jenny McCarthy's story, this is one of the primary problems that she faced. Corporate power, again, right, people who are interested in alternative medicine and kind of live that naturalistic, holistic lifestyle are very suspicious of the kind of corporate influence over our lives. And then if you saw how that woman, the woman from Ashland operated, she had a very strong sense of parental responsibility, right? And that's something that parents do take upon themselves and value a lot, right? Not everybody's a deadbeat dad or deadbeat mom, and it's a good thing too, right? The review goes on to say that these broader issues cannot be settled by evidence that vaccines are safe and effective. Now, that's a pretty big statement. I don't know what you think about that. Maybe you disagree, but that's what Largent thinks, right? And so he suggests that the controversy cannot be settled by just educating the ignorant, hysterical parents and imposing some policy proposal that's going to strengthen laws in order to compel vaccine compliance, right? That's probably going to make things worse, he says, right? So he's a guy. Look, actually, he's a defender of vaccines. He thinks they're very important. He thinks that compliance is all good. He had a little worries about the spacing and scheduling, but he bought into it, right, for the most part. So, his book is pretty interesting, all right? Now, actually, that was a 2012 publication. In 2017, which is only a couple years ago now, he co-authored a book with Christopher Navin, whose book was also reviewed in that review I had you read, but I didn't sign it. And he actually now comes up with a policy recommendation to compel vaccine compliance, right? And he does, and his big worry is not making things worse, all right? So how is he going to pull that off? Well, Navin and Largent argue in their paper that just merely inconveniencing those who would refuse to immunize for non-medical reasons is the best policy, as opposed to eliminating or prioritizing religious policies, right? Or religious non-medical exemptions is what that should say there, right? All right, so we don't want to eliminate non-medical exemptions, and we don't want to prioritize non-medical exemptions, okay? So a couple things here I just want to say. I actually have met Christopher Navin. He's a pretty impressive person. The guy can talk a mile a minute, and it's really quite incredible. I remember going to a presentation in Michigan on this very subject of his, and it was pretty impressive. I really couldn't keep up with him. He talked so fast. But he shares the same ideas as Largent to a large extent. He doesn't want to get rid of the non-medical exemptions. Okay, so non-medical exemptions, if you don't know what these are the kind of conscience clauses that states carve out in their vaccination laws. So if you have like a religiously based objection, okay, or if you have some kind of moral, personal reason, a philosophical difference, all right, these are reasons why people are seeking exemptions from the law. Okay, so medical reasons, of course, are those that have to do with a person's medical condition. They're immunocompromised, or they're immunodeficient in some way. So, little tiny babies, or cancer patients, maybe AIDS patients who haven't gotten the proper treatment, right? These are people who are going to be vulnerable to vaccines. It actually could really hurt them, okay? So let's just kind of turn to their paper here and talk about some of the key terms and arguments, right? Let's talk about eliminationism, right? It's an interesting policy, and it has been in practice before, all right? It's this idea that to say, look, these non-medical exemptions, these religious exemptions, these conscience clauses, those are gone. Bye-bye, they're eliminated from the law. You don't get that way out anymore, okay? So look, you either just obey the law or you don't, right? And so it's a kind of really strong state empowered policy, okay? And enrollment in places like public schools or daycare centers are permitted only if one is vaccine compliant, okay? So you gotta be on schedule with these people, right? Here in South Carolina, I mean, I have kids in daycare, and you got to be on schedule, okay? So that's just part of the way it goes, all right? Otherwise, you can't access a good like daycare, right? Now, you can get an exemption so long as it's a medical condition, okay? That's it. Now, this recently passed in California. There's an interesting legal article here that kind of gets into the constitutional law of all of that, and you can check that out on your own time if you'd like. It's pretty interesting, right? It's just a legal argument. It's not a philosophical one. So if you're interested in the law, it's a good place to look. And that was passed in the wake of the Disneyland outbreak. All right, so, and if you remember, the LA Times here reports that vaccine refusal helped create that outbreak. Right, that's according to a study, and they report on it here. It's an interesting story. You can check it out. Now, I've been to Disneyland in Anaheim, and boy, oh boy, is that place ever a zoo. And it's not surprising, you get a ton of people packed together, lots of visitors, lots of people who have kids, right, that aren't vaccinated. And, because Californians, they're a diverse bunch. There's going to be the people that want to live in the naturalistic, holistic lifestyle out there. And so you had an outbreak, and so this was judged to be a public health disaster. And so California did away with the exemption clauses. They thought that was the source of the problem. Now, this isn't a new thing, okay? One of the things that's a little misleading about the article that I had you read here by Navin and Largent is that the eliminationist policy has actually been around for quite a while. In 1979, good old Mississippi had a Supreme Court case go to its state high court, the Mississippi Supreme Court, where a guy wanted to, say, hey, I don't want to vaccinate my kid for religious reasons. And you know what? The court said, well, too bad. You got to do it. All right? Oh, ad blocker stuff. Whatever. Anyway, you can read about that on that link I gave you there. It's pretty funny. And Mississippi, believe it or not, even though they have some of the worst health outcomes in the country, has some of the best vaccination rates in the country. Like, they are always really, really high up. I mean, it's kind of amazing, right? So you kind of contrast places like Washington and Oregon, Colorado, right? These western kind of progressive states, with the backwoods, deep south, rural state like Mississippi, and Mississippi's got them beat by a mile. I mean, it's just incredible. So, and that's because eliminationism is that just rules the day, right? So there you have it. Okay. Now, inconvenience. What that means basically is just non-medical exemptions are just harder to get. Okay, so you got to jump through more hoops. There's more regulations, more paperwork you got to go through. Right, if you've gone to a place like a DMV and you try to get stuff done, sometimes the government does build a bunch of hoop jumping into its processes to kind of keep people out of getting the good, right? And this is one of the things that comes up in voting laws, right? And why that can be an injustice, right? So inconvenience is a mechanism, right, that the government can deploy. And let's all be honest, it can be really good at doing this, right? This is like one function of government that's pretty awesome in its capacity. They know how to inconvenient people, all right. So why not use that to our advantage and make these exemptions harder to get, all right? Because if they're easy to get, well, then non-compliance really goes upward. It's like, well, I just don't have to do that. I'll just file for, an exemption. The exemption's easy to get, and there you go. Now you have a bunch of non-compliant people. Okay, let's just make one more distinction here between the compulsory and mandatory vaccination. And a compulsory vaccination is it's a scenario in which it's a crime not to vaccinate your kid. Okay, unless there's like a medical reason, and if there's not, and you don't do it, right, you're subject to criminal penalties. Right. By contrast, mandatory vaccination has to do with requiring vaccination for access to societal goods. All right. So here it's kind of more of a positive reinforcement issue. It's like, okay, you want that. All right. Well, in order to participate in this institutional and public good, you have to get vaccinated. Right, so it's a mandatory thing, right? So they're both coercive. One is more heavy-handed than the other, all right? And so most of the states in the country go with the mandatory thing, right? Compulsory vaccination is pretty rare. That only really comes up if there's like a real serious outbreak, right? And there's a deadly disease on our hands. Okay, that's when the state is going to kind of start exercising that sort of power. All right, so let's talk about their arguments against eliminationism. All right, so Navin and Largent, they don't care for eliminationism. They actually think that the Mississippi and California models are bad. Now, they think that one of the problems here, and they think this is going to be a problem for California, this is what they're predicting, is that that the policy will trigger otherwise avoidable political consequences. Now, what exactly are those? Well, what you're going to end up doing is not actually creating the refusers into compliant people, what they're going to do is just withdraw further from society. Right? So society says, hey, you want to send your kids to public school? You want your kids to go to daycare? Well, they got to get vaccinated. And the refuser go, well, okay, we just won't go to public school, and we won't go to daycare. We're all going to become homeschoolers and live in a commune. All right, now that just does not change the vaccination rate. Okay, that doesn't actually promote the goal of a high vaccination rate. What you end up getting is a community like Ashland, Oregon, right, where everybody kind of gets on board with the vaccine hesitancy and refusal, and refuses to participate in society's institutions, and that's where those communities are the most vulnerable to outbreak. Okay, so the kind of libertarian, like, well, you know what, people can just do what they want, nobody's forcing you to do this. Here's the thing, though, if you don't do this, you just can't participate in these public goods. And you know what, if it's your choice to use those or not, right? But these are the conditions. That kind of attitude is actually not going to promote public health, they think. All right, so that's what they think. But it seems reasonable enough. And now, if you disagree with that, that could be a good paper that you want to write on. All right, but that's basically like the first reason they give. I think it's mentioned later in the paper because the one they mentioned first is this next reason, right? The reason I did this one first because it's just simple, right? It's nice and simple. Right? Oh, geez. There we go. Eliminationism. The second reason they think they think this is a problem is that it fails to accommodate morally justifiable religious liberty claims. Okay. All right. So this is a big topic. All right. Religious liberty claims are all over the place today. Now you've probably known about them in the news, right? When the Supreme Court ruled in Obergefell v. Hodges that gay marriage was the law of the land, that triggered a lot of religious liberty concerns, right? Will, like a wedding baker or photographer, have to bake a cake for a gay couple or photograph their gay wedding? And you got all these court cases propping up, and it produced a lot of debate in society, and it was really, people are kind of suspicious of religious liberty claims because of this, right? In popular culture, you kind of find this sense that, I don't know about this, right? Yeah, and so, that's something I kind of want to talk about a little bit is, why is it that our legal system accommodates these things? Like, what's so special about religion? Okay, and so the answer here that they give in the paper, and this is the standard answer, by the way, is that being forced by a policy, a government policy, okay, to act against one's deepest sense of values, or one's sense of the harmony with the transcendent, which is God usually, is a uniquely harmful experience. Okay, so there's two examples I want to give here. The first one is more recent. In the wake of Roe v. Wade, right, there was a concern about doctors and nurses, having to be forced to perform abortions. All right, and so back when that Supreme Court decision was handed down, there was some legislation that was passed that, okay, people have like deeply held beliefs and deep sense of values about abortion, and being forced to participate in one certainly seems like a terrible harm. Now, that's beside whether or not you think abortion is wrong or not. If you believe it's wrong and you're forced to do something you're wrong, that's a harmful experience. Of course, the paradigm example is the example of the conscientious objector. Okay, and so the idea is the government has a conscription policy. You have to go to war. You have to take up arms against your fellow man, and commit violent acts against them. And you have a deeply held belief and value system, right, that forbids you from killing people or committing acts of violence against them that would harm your sense of harmony with the transcendent. And the government acknowledged this. This is kind of a terrible thing to do to people, all right? And so what is done then is that we carve out an exemption. All right, and so the same kind of argument, the same kind of issue that's at issue, all right, gets used in the immunization debate. All right, so here's the argument I want to kind of rehearse with you, and I want you to kind of think about it and see what you think. See if you think it's a good one. All right, if religious exemptions to immunization policies are not permitted, right, then pursuit of the basic human good of harmony with oneself and one's sense of the transcendent will be substantially burdened by the government for some members of our pluralistic society. Okay? All right, a couple things I want to talk about here. This is an interesting premise because it uses this language, basic human good, right? This is like a fundamental human interest, right? This is something that is deemed to be part of a flourishing human life, that we pursue harmony with the transcendent. Now, you might be an atheist, but that's okay. You're going to want to you want to live in harmony with those atheistic beliefs. When somebody says, "Hey, you have to pledge allegiance to the flag and one nation under God," right? People kind of object to that. They get a little ornery and say, "I don't know," right? And you can understand why that might be substantially burdened. And we do live in a pluralistic society. People have different commitments. Right, and so you might think, all right, that makes sense. And this should not be something that's substantially burdened unless there's a compelling reason to do so. Okay, so it's not absolute. Okay, it's not absolute. All right. If there is a compelling interest, then you might just have to suck it up and deal with it. Okay, and that's just the way it goes. But you know what? Hey, there isn't one. There isn't one. Wow, okay. And so therefore, the religious exemptions to immunization policies should be permitted. One of the kind of interesting things they say in their papers, they think that vaccine hesitant parents can be reasonable, right? And that, look, it's not so bad. We're not living in kind of some kind of catastrophe where there's this big outbreak and people are dying. It's like, well, it's something to be concerned about. But hey, we can kind of get on board with this, right? All right, okay. So what do you think of that argument, all right? What do you think of that argument? Now, I adapt this argument out of a book, all right? I just want to draw your attention to it here. It is a really interesting book. It actually has to do with the kind of gay marriage discrimination stuff that's going on in the culture and religious liberty, and these guys write about it. And I took it out of this book, right? And I adapted it for the immunization policies. So if you're interested in this kind of topic beyond the scope of this course, I just recommend that to you. All right. But, what do you think of the argument? Is it a good argument? Is it a bad argument? Do you think these premises are true? All right. Think about that. Okay, so here's the issue here. The harm to be avoided when a conscientious objection to the policy is, let me see, what are they trying to say here? All right, the harm is to be avoided. There we go, the to be. When an objection to the policy will not undermine the goals of the policy. Okay, so there's a condition here, all right? The number of non-medical exemptions to the policy has to be small. And so that's kind of supporting premise 3 here if you were worried, all right? The authors also believe that the vaccine refusers are not always irrational, and most have reasonable explanations for their behavior. So again, look, you might disagree with somebody like Jenny Margulis, but it's hard to say that she's just totally irrational, all right? It seems like she's trying to make a reasonable case, and so you might want to give her that room, that intellectual space, all right? Because a lot of the worries about vaccine safety, they're coming from, this idea of, hey, you're violating my natural holistic lifestyle with this thing, all right? There's an objection to government intrusion into parental responsibility, right? There might actually be a concern that, this is a scientific question, I realize, but over the safety of vaccines, right? And so if you have these things, if you're believing these things, right, you can understand, right, why somebody would be hesitant at least, okay? All right. Okay, so again, they go on to say that eliminationism may be permissible if the number of non-medical exemptions to immunization is not relevantly small. All right, so elimination may be permissible. Okay, it might be permissible if if we get beyond like tolerance here, right? This is the herd immunity problem, and there's a nice little graphic here I just kind of wanted to show you, right? How does it work? Well, okay, so here's the unvaccinated population, all right, and here's two people in red that are sick, and they can really get hurt from an infectious disease. And so, the disease kind of spreads through the population, people get mildly ill, and then boom, these people get nailed, right? And they get hurt bad, maybe they die. In the vaccinated population, okay, so there's some people who aren't vaccinated here, but then boom, 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 okay, look at that, right? What happens here is that the disease does not spread, okay, and our people over here are saved, right? So imagine that these red dots here are down here, okay? It doesn't spread, right? That's the big idea. Now this isn't exactly. I'm not entirely sure how this drawing is working because it seems like it shouldn't be able to transfer if this person's vaccinated. So let's pretend that one's green. Right, and that way that person would be saved. At any rate, the idea is that there's enough people who are vaccinated who just don't spread the disease to the sick people. Okay, these people are protected. Right? So then, if that's gone, well then this premise 3 falls apart. All right? So that's why I was trying to explain all that there. It's just to kind of help you understand the argument. Right? So premise 3 is probably the most debatable one, but I want you to think too about these first 2 premises and whether or not you think those are true. Okay, so let's talk about inconvenience. All right, inconvenience, what's the deal with that? All right, inconvenience allows non-medical exemptions. Yes, they're permitted, but it makes it burdensome to get them. Okay, and this is happening in Michigan these days. Now, in 2013, Michigan was 4th in the U.S. in non-medical exemptions. Right, and so a way to address that problem, public policy makers implemented an inconvenience policy. It was harder to get waivers, and the waivers fell by 39%. Okay, and so what the authors conclude here is that inconvenience has the twin advantages of being fair to non-compliant parents, right, in their liberty interests, but also it meets the goal of increasing immunization rates. All right, so that was the problem that was facing the eliminationist one, is that it's possible this isn't going to work out. Right, now maybe Mississippi got lucky, right? But who knows what's going to happen in California? California and Mississippi are 2 very different states, right? What works in one, it isn't guaranteed it's going to work in the other. Okay, that's just a fact. All right. The other thing too that's kind of nice about inconvenience is that it has bipartisan support. All right, the California policy actually became polarized. So Democrats were very much in favor of it, while Republicans were not. All right, and so, if you can avoid, right, the kind of fights in Congress over your policies, all the better, right? So that's another thing that inconvenience has going for it, right? Now, here's something I want you to think about, okay? Let's think about the burdens. What exactly are they? Well, in addition, right, to, just like having to kind of file the exemption, you then have to go to a kind of educational appointment, right? And so you're going to get some vaccine education, right? There's going to be a public health person that you'll meet with, and they're going to try and train you and help you answer questions and understand why it is the state is requiring these things. Right, so what this does is it compels the opportunity for dialogue. It gets people at least out of their echo chambers. People can't just withdraw from society. They're going to have to engage someone from society and talk about this stuff. And maybe there's going to be an opportunity for a restoration of public trust. Right, when you can meet with somebody, it's always better than just dealing with a document. That's always the case. And the burden is not insurmountable, right? If you want to steadfastly refuse, all right, but you can do it. It's not a BS policy where it's like, well, here's a bunch of burdens, but you can overburden someone so much that it's just insurmountable, and that just becomes a functional eliminationist policy. All right. So I want you to think, do you find the case for inconvenience to be better than for elimination? Okay, what do you think? Do you think the authors are on something here? All right, let's talk about some objections. All right, so the problem is that, well, at least some allege, is that the inconvenience model really ends up being no fairer than the elimination model to those who, for medical reasons, cannot be vaccinated. I mean, these are the people that we're primarily concerned about, are we not? All right, so the inconvenience model, is just doing, it's not really making any improvement for them. Okay, they're going to still remain vulnerable to unvaccinated persons either way. All right, and so since our first duty should be to protect them, right, vaccine refusers should be forced to contribute to their well-being in some way. And the "there" here is referring to the medically vulnerable, okay? So, anti-vaxxers they're going to have to contribute to the people who could get hurt, right, by their kids, okay? And if they're going to pursue a non-medical exemption. So, look, the non-medical exemption could still be available to them, but they're going to have to contribute. And this is called the contribution model. If you follow this link, there'll be a link to the paper that kind of spells it out. Right, I'm not going to open it here because I want to get this lecture done. A potential reply is there's no principal way to measure the contribution piece apart from imposing fines. And that's going to go beyond the goals of inconvenience. That's going to be a penal system. And that's actually going to turn the mandatory vaccination system into a compulsory one. Once you start imposing punishments on people, right? And that's what it's going to be looked at, this idea of a contribution. That sounds like something that's kind of benevolent. And so, this maybe sounds like this is going to sound like newspeak, right, to the people, or propaganda to your anti-vax crowd. So, that's one way of kind of addressing that objection. So think about that. Is that a good objection? And if it is, then how do you answer this reply? Okay? Or do you think this reply is a good one, right? Second objection, what exactly counts as non-medical, right? So this is kind of a big, we've already talked about this a little bit. Okay, but here's the thing I want to highlight. Many who desire to refuse vaccines do for what they believe are medical reasons, right? But their objections just aren't recognized as such, so then they go with the non-medical one. But it seems like the issue here is that we're actually debating a lot of this is just medicine, right? The vaccine schedule, this is a medical thing, right? This is a medical regimen. And it's you either follow it or you don't. There's good evidence for it or not. And the reply here is just like, well, this is just determined by current medical science, and that's that, okay? Alternative medicine, sorry about you don't count. Okay, now you might think that that's a good reply. You might not think that's a good reply. You might want to think about that and analyze that a bit and see whether or not that works, all right? All right, last objection here is that none of these models address the real elephant in the room, and that is rebuilding the trust in traditional medicine through a patient-centered approach rather than a system-centered approach. And this was the paper by Bester that I assigned. Okay, it's a short little paper. It kind of gets into the landscape of things here that we've talked about. And he just thinks that this is like, come on, people. All this stuff is short-term goals, right? Elimination, inconvenience, right? Really what you're doing is you're putting a Band-Aid on a gushing wound here. What really is going on deeply in our culture here is a suspicion of public institutions, public health, and evidence-based traditional medicine, right? So what's the reply going to be to that, right? Now I want you to think about that. I mean, I can think of a couple, right? But what do you think about that? Okay, I want to leave that open. All right, and so basically, that's the lecture here. I want you to think about whether or not any of these objections have any merit. What do you think of the religious liberty argument, right? What inhibits trust, right? How can that be repaired, right? That's what I'm going to be kind of thinking about when I put together the discussion, the discussion instructions for week 2. All right, so this is immunization lecture. It's all done, and if you have any questions, right, just post them in the discussion section of the Canvas page or shoot me an email. All right, talk to you later.